Alright, so now we're going to learn another method of factoring. We're going to be factoring by something called grouping. We use the grouping method when our polynomial has 4 terms. We are going to factor our polynomial into the product of 2 binomials. When we first start off, if there's a GCF, we should take it out first before we begin the grouping method. But basically the grouping method is exactly how it sounds. We're going to be grouping terms together using a set of parentheses. Now in number 1, there is a greatest common factor between all 4 terms. All 4 terms are divisible by 3 and they all have at least one h in it. So I factor out the 3h and now I rewrite my polynomial without the 3h in it. A 6 divided by a 3 is a 2, so I have a 2 and then an h cubed because I took away one h, plus a 9 divided by a 3 is a 3, and then I have an h squared because I took away one h, plus a 12 divided by a 3 is a 4, h, plus an 18 divided by a 3 is a 6, and I took away that one h, so that one doesn't have an h in it. Now, on the terms that are remaining inside your brackets, we are going to group them using a set of parentheses. We are going to group my first 2 terms together and my last 2 terms, including the operation that goes in front of those 2 terms together. And now we are going to use something that we learned in level 1. We're going to use greatest common factor. Between my first 2 terms, my greatest common factor is an h squared. I'm going to factor that h squared out, and rewriting my 2 terms without that h squared in it, I'm left with a 2h plus a 3. Now in my next 2 terms, I need to take out the common operation and the common GCF here. So I'm going to take out an addition. You always must take out an operation out of the next 2 terms, and I'm going to take a 2 out, and I will be left with a 2h plus a 3. Now you know if you did the grouping correctly, if what's left in parentheses matches exactly. So now all we have to do is write our answer. So we first state our GCF, if we have one, which in this case we do, that's a 3h. Then one of your binomials, because remember we're rewriting these as a product of 2 binomials. One of your binomials is the stuff that's on the outside of your parentheses, so that's the h squared plus 2. And another one of your binomials is one of the sets of parentheses. Since they match, we know that we just write one of them, which is a 2h plus a 3. And this is your answer. Now the order that your binomials goes in does not matter because multiplication is commutative. So you could have wrote a 3h times a 2h plus 3 times an h squared plus 2. But that is fully factored. Moving on to number 2, out of all 4 of my terms, they do not have a GCF. So we jump straight into the grouping method without taking out a GCF because there isn't one. We group our first 2 terms together, and we group our last 2 terms together, including the operation that goes in front of those last 2 terms. Now, my greatest common factor out of a 20r squared and a plus 8r would be a 4r. And now rewriting that 20r squared plus 8r without the 4r in it, I would have a 5r plus a 2. Out of my next 2 terms, I must take out an operation, which I'm going to take out an addition sign, and a number. I'm going to take out a plus 3. And when I take out that plus 3, I'm left with a 5r plus a 2. You know that you did the problem correctly if both sets of your parentheses match exactly, which they do. So now we write one of our binomials is the stuff that's on the outside of parentheses, so that's the 4r plus a 3. And another one of your binomials is just one set of these 2 parentheses, and they match exactly, so we just need to write down one of them, a 5r plus 2. This is fully factored. Now, how you could check to see if you have the correct factored form is you could use the FOIL method and distribute this out to see if you wind up with your original problem. But this is the answer that I want because I want it in factored form. I do not want it simplified. All right, looking at number 3, looking at all 4 terms, none of them have a greatest common factor. We're going to jump straight into that grouping. Group the first 2 terms, group the last 2 terms, including the operation. My greatest common factor out of my first 2 terms would be a 2t, and I'd be left with a 4t plus 7. I need to take an operation out of my next 2 terms, which is going to be a plus sign, and a number. The number that they have in common is a 5, and I'd be left with a 4t plus 7. You know you did the grouping correctly if the 2 sets of parentheses match exactly. So one of your binomials is going to be the stuff on the outside of parentheses, which is a 2t plus 5. And your other binomial is just one set of your parentheses, which is a 4t plus 7. All right, looking at number 4, there is no greatest common factor between these 4 terms, so we jump straight into grouping. I'm going to group my first 2 and my last 2, including the operation between my last 2. My greatest common factor out of my first 2 terms would be a 7z squared, and I'd be left with a 2z minus 5. I need to take an operation out of my next 2, which would be a plus sign, because again, we want the parentheses to match exactly. And my greatest common factor would be an 8 out of those 2, and I'd be left with a 2z minus 5. So one of the sets of one of your binomials is the stuff outside of your parentheses, which is a 7z squared plus an 8. And your other binomial is just one set of your parentheses. Now I do want to mention that if this was a minus 16z plus a 40, then we would want to take out a minus 8 to be left with a positive 2z minus 5. So we're not always going to be taking out a plus something. We might be taking out a minus sign. You just have to make sure that when you factor out that negative, that you see if your sets of parentheses match. Again, your goal is to get the 2 sets of parentheses to match exactly. All right, so this is the first lesson in level 2. There is one more lesson, so continue on to the next video.